What happens when a revered Indian sage steps into the heart of the British Empire? Swami Vivekananda's journey to London and Paris reveals an inspiring blend of cultural exchange and spiritual awakening. Welcome to another episode of our series on Swami Vivekananda's extraordinary life. In this episode, we follow the Swami as he embarks on a significant journey to London and Paris. His aim? To share the wisdom of Vedanta with the Western world. From his interactions with influential figures to his transformative encounters with new friends and admirers, join us as we explore how Vivekananda made an indelible impact in the West and how his mission resonated deeply with some of the brightest minds of his time. Chapter 8: Experiences in the West. For some time, Swami Vivekananda had been planning a visit to London. He wished to sow the seed of Vedanta in the capital of the mighty British Empire. Miss Henrietta Muller had extended to him a cordial invitation to come to London, and Mr. E.T. Sturdy had requested him to stay at his home there. Mr. Leggett, too, had invited the Swami to come to Paris as his guest. Mr. Francis H. Leggett, whose hospitality the Swami had already enjoyed at Percy, was a wealthy businessman of New York. He and two ladies of his acquaintance, Mrs. William Sturgis and Miss Josephine MacLeod, who were sisters, had attended the Swami's lectures in New York during the previous winter. They were all impressed by the Swami's personality and his message, and Mr. Leggett remarked one day that the teacher was a man of great common sense. An intimate emotional relationship gradually developed between the Swami, the two sisters, and Mr. Leggett. Mrs. Sturgis, who was a widow, and Mr. Leggett became engaged and announced their engagement at the summer camp at Percy. They decided to be married in Paris, and Mr. Leggett invited the Swami to be a witness at the ceremony. This invitation coming at the same time as Miss Muller's and Mr. Sturdy's seemed to the Swami, as he described it in a letter, a divine call. The Swami's New York. Friends thought that a sea voyage would be most beneficial for his weary body and mind. At this time, the Swami began to feel a premonition of his approaching end. One day he even said, "My day is done." But the awareness of his unfulfilled mission made him forget his body. The Swami and Mr. Leggett sailed from New York about the middle of August 1895, reaching Paris by the end of the month. The French metropolis, with its museums, churches, cathedrals, palaces, and art galleries, impressed him as the center of European culture, and he was introduced to a number of enlightened French people. When Swami Vivekananda arrived in London, he was enthusiastically greeted by Miss Muller, who had already met him in America, and Mr. Sturdy, who had studied Sanskrit and had to a certain degree practiced asceticism in the Himalayas. The Swami's mind, one can imagine, was filled with tumultuous thoughts as he arrived in the great city. He was eager to test his ability as an interpreter of the spiritual culture of India in the very citadel of the English-speaking nations. He also knew that he belonged to a subject race, which had been under the imperialistic domination of England for almost 140 years. He attributed India's suffering, at least in part, to this alien rule. He was not unaware of the arrogance of the British ruling class in India, to whom India was a benighted country steeped in superstition. Would the Britishers give a patient hearing to the religion and philosophy of his ancestors, of which he was so proud? Would they not rather think that nothing good could ever come out of Nazareth? He did not, as we learn from his own confession, set foot on English soil with the friendliest of feelings. But how he felt when he left England after his short visit will be presently described. After a few days' rest, the Swami quietly began his work. Through friends, he was gradually introduced to people who were likely to be interested in his thoughts. He also devoted part of his time to visiting places of historical interest. Within 3 weeks of his arrival, he was already engaged in strenuous activity. A class was started, and soon the hall was found inadequate to accommodate the students. Newspapers interviewed him and called him the Hindu yogi. Lady Isabel Margesson and several other members of the nobility became attracted to the Swami's teachings. His first public lecture was attended by many educated and thoughtful people. Some of the leading newspapers were enthusiastic about it. The Standard compared his moral stature with that of Ram Mohan Roy and Keshab Chandra Sen. The London Daily Chronicle wrote that he reminded people of Buddha. Even the heads of churches showed their warm appreciation. But the Swami's greatest acquisition in London was Miss Margaret E. Noble, who later became his disciple, consecrating her life to women's education in India. She also espoused the cause of India's political freedom and inspired many of its leaders with her written and spoken words. Miss Noble, the fourth child of Samuel Noble, was born in Northern Ireland in 1867. Both her grandfather and her father were Protestant ministers in the Wesleyan Church and took active part in the political agitation for the freedom of Ireland. Her grandmother and her father gave her instruction in the Bible. Her father, who died at the age of 34, had a premonition of his daughter's future calling. One of the last things he whispered to his wife was about Margaret. When God calls her, he said, "Let her go. She will spread her wings. She will do great things." After finishing her college education, Margaret took the position of a teacher at Keswick in the English Lake District, where contact with the High Church stirred her religious emotions. Next, she taught in an orphanage in Rugby, where she shared the manual labor of the pupils. At 21, Miss Noble was appointed as mistress at the secondary school in Wrexham, a large mining centre, and participated in the welfare activities of the town, visiting slum households and looking for waifs and strays. Next, she went to Chester and taught a class of 18-year-old girls. Here, she delved into the educational systems of Pestalozzi and Froebel. And finally, she came to London, where, in the autumn of 1895, she opened her own school, the Ruskin School, in Wimbledon. The metropolis of the British Empire offered Miss Noble unlimited opportunities for the realization of her many latent desires, political, literary, and educational. Here she joined the Free Ireland group, working for Ireland's Home Rule. She was also cordially received at Lady Ripon's exclusive salon, where art and literature were regularly discussed. This salon later developed into the Sesame Club, with rooms in Dover Street, where Bernard Shaw, T.H. Huxley, and other men of literature and science discussed highly intellectual subjects. Margaret Noble became the secretary of the club and lectured on the psychology of the child and the rights of women. Thus, even before she met Swami Vivekananda, she was unconsciously preparing the ground for her future activities in India. At this time, Margaret suffered a cruel blow. She was deeply in love with a man and had even set the wedding date, but another woman suddenly snatched him away. A few years before, another young man to whom she was about to be engaged had died of tuberculosis. These experiences shocked her profoundly, and she began to take a more serious interest in religion. She was very fond of a simple prayer by Thomas à Kempis, "Be what thou prayest to be made." One day, her art teacher, Ebenezer Cook, said to Margaret, "Lady Isabel Margesson is inviting a few friends to her house to hear a Hindu Swami speak. Will you come?" Swami Vivekananda had already been a topic of discussion among certain members of the Sesame Club. Mr. E.T. Sturdy and Miss Henrietta Muller had told of his extraordinary success in America as a preacher and orator. Miss Noble first met Swami Vivekananda on a Sunday evening in the drawing room of Lady Isabel Margesson, situated in the fashionable West End of London. He was to address a group of people on Hindu thought. Miss Noble was one of the last to arrive. 15 people sat in the room in absolute silence. She nervously felt as if all eyes were turned on her, and as she took the first vacant chair, she gathered her skirt to sit down without making any noise. The Swami sat facing her. A coal fire burnt on the hearth behind him. She noticed that he was tall and well-built and possessed an air of deep serenity. The effect of his long practice of meditation was visible in the gentleness and loftiness of his look, which, as she was to write later, Raphael has perhaps painted for us on the brow of the Sistine Child. The Swami looked at Lady Isabel with a sweet smile as she said, "Swamiji, all our friends are here." He chanted some Sanskrit verses, Miss Noble was impressed by his melodious voice. She heard the Swami say, among other things, "All our struggle is for freedom. We seek neither misery nor happiness, but freedom, freedom alone." In our next episode, we follow Swami Vivekananda's return to New York and delve into his subsequent activities and reflections. From his profound influence on his followers to his stirring public lectures, we'll see how his time in the West shaped his mission and deepened his connection with audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. Join us as we uncover the final chapters of his Western journey and the lasting impressions he left behind. Thank you for listening till the end. Please subscribe, turn on the notifications, like, comment, and share with your friends. This will help more listeners to discover our channel and content.